If you're doing anything right now, keep going. This isn't a pause, it's not an exercise, and it doesn't require your full attention. It's just something to listen to while life continues. You might notice that your mind is still trying to hold everything together, even when nothing urgent is really happening. And maybe, just for now, you don't need to fix that. There is a kind of tiredness that doesn't come from the body. You can sleep and still wake up feeling heavy. You can stop and still feel that something inside won't let go. Almost no one notices the exact moment when this tension begins to loosen. It isn't dramatic, it isn't visible, but when it happens, life starts to respond in a different way. Come back with me for a moment, not to change anything, just to observe. Maybe you've gotten used to a constant pressure. Not the kind everyone sees, but the internal one. The feeling that you should be doing more, thinking better, getting further. Even in moments of rest, the mind keeps working. Replaying what was missing, anticipating what's coming, correcting what is already past. As if relaxing were a mistake. And even if your attention drifted just now, come back with me for a moment. Days change, hours pass, but something inside seems to stay in the same place. You wake up, handle what you need to, move forward, and still there's a strange feeling of repetition. It's not the external routine, it's the internal one. The same thoughts, the same self-demands, the same silent weight. Maybe it isn't a lack of opportunity. Maybe it's an excess of accumulated tension. At some point, you began fighting your own mind, trying to control thoughts, forcing focus, pushing motivation. And the more you push, the more tired you become. It's exhausting to try to defeat something that lives inside you. Maybe that's why so many people give up in silence, not from weakness, but from inner exhaustion. Breathe, without adjusting anything. Just observe. There is a point where effort stops helping. You insist, you pressure yourself, you push a little more, and still nothing moves. Not because you don't want it to, but because the mind is too rigid to flow. Maybe the problem was never a lack of control. Maybe it was too much control. And what if, for a moment, you didn't need to solve this? Almost no one notices when it begins. It isn't a big insight. It isn't a radical decision. It's a small loosening, a thought that doesn't react, a breath that sinks a little deeper, a brief silence, but a real one. In that moment, the mind doesn't win. It yields. And when it yields, something changes inside before it changes outside. Maybe this has already happened to you, even if you never gave it a name. When the mind begins to relax, the first feeling isn't always relief. Sometimes it's discomfort, because the constant noise was hiding something. And when it quiets down, what was underneath starts to surface. A subtle emptiness, a strangeness that's hard to name. As if you've spent so long busy on the inside that you no longer remember what it's like to simply be here. This silence doesn't hurt, but it does expose. And that's why so many people run from it, returning to distractions, tasks, noise. Maybe you're noticing this now, even if only in passing. And even if it feels strange, there's nothing wrong here. When the autopilot weakens, the mind temporarily loses its script, and a quiet question appears. What now? Not as anxiety, but as the absence of automatic direction. You're not lost, you're just not being pushed. For a long time, decisions came from pressure, fear, urgency. When that loosens, the body feels unfamiliar because it never learned how to move without being pulled. Maybe that's why this moment feels empty. But in truth, it's clean. And cleaning always comes before creating. With less noise, some memories begin to rise, not as full scenes, but as sensations. An old tiredness, an unresolved frustration, a promise you made to yourself and forgot along the way. None of this comes to punish you. It comes because now there is enough space to be felt. Before, the mind was too busy defending itself. Now it begins to release what has been held for a long time. And even if your attention drifts in and out, this is already happening. There is a kind of exhaustion that comes from holding up an inner image, the image of the one who endures, who fixes things, who never stops. Relaxing the mind is not giving up. It's stopping the effort of carrying a weight that was never meant to be carried alone. Maybe you learned early on that you had to handle everything, and that became an identity. But identity also grows tired when it isn't allowed to rest. And maybe, just maybe, it's not you who needs to change, but the constant effort to remain rigid. There comes a point when emptiness stops being frightening. You realize it isn't absence, it's open space. Space where the mind isn't fighting, where the body isn't defending itself, where nothing needs to be decided right now. This space doesn't shout, it doesn't demand attention, but it holds something new. It's here that new perceptions begin to form, not as forced ideas, but as natural movements. Before any external change, this is where everything begins to reorganize. And even if you don't know what comes next, not knowing right now is exactly the point. At some point, without warning, something shifts in the way a thought appears. It shows up, but it doesn't push. It doesn't demand a response. It doesn't ask to be fixed. It doesn't create urgency. You almost find it strange, because you're used to thoughts that arrive pulling you along, that command, that pressure, that anticipate consequences. This one is different. It appears and allows you to keep breathing. It doesn't take control of the body. It doesn't speed up the heart. It doesn't trigger scenarios. It simply passes. You may not have noticed it right away, because the mind has always been too loud to perceive subtlety. But something in you recognizes it. This is new. Not because it's intense, but because it's light. And this lightness doesn't need to be defended. For a long time, the mind believed it needed control to keep you safe. Control decisions, control emotions, control outcomes. It learned that relaxing meant opening space for mistakes, so it stayed vigilant, alert, rigid. But when it begins to relax, it isn't abandonment, it's recognition, Recognition that trying to control everything also has a cost, a quiet cost, constant, exhausting. There is a different kind of intelligence when the mind is not fighting, an intelligence that observes first, that waits for the right moment, that doesn't react to the first impulse. You feel this as less rush, less inner urgency, less need to prove something, and curiously, decisions begin to feel clearer. It isn't happiness, it isn't excitement, it's something more discreet, a sense of things are being held for now. Nothing has changed outside, but inside, something stopped arguing with the present. This gratitude doesn't come from achievements, it doesn't come from results, it doesn't come from applause. It's born from relief. From the relief of not needing to be at war with every moment. You're not grateful for something specific, you simply notice that the weight has eased, and that is enough. Maybe you've never considered how much relief itself is a form of wealth. When the mind relaxes, something subtle happens. You realize that life continues even without your constant vigilance. The body breathes on its own. The heart beats without command. The day moves forward without being pushed. This creates a new feeling, not mystical, not religious, but real. The feeling that you are not alone carrying everything through effort. That there is something greater than control, greater than tension, greater than the fear of making mistakes. You don't need to name it. You simply feel that you can let go a little more. And letting go is not losing. External situations are still there. Responsibilities, commitments, decisions. Nothing has disappeared, but the way you look changes. You begin to notice nuances that once went unseen, less obvious options, simpler paths, small adjustments that actually work. Not because you became smarter, but because you stopped being tense. A less rigid mind sees clearly. It doesn't project as much fear. It doesn't anticipate failure as much. It observes what is available now. And that changes everything without needing to announce a change. Clarity doesn't shout. It organizes itself. You may notice something curious. Money still matters. Bills still exist. Responsibilities continue. But it no longer occupies the same mental space. Before, financial thoughts came loaded with tension. Fear of not having enough, fear of making mistakes, fear of not being sufficient. Now, the thought appears cleaner, not because everything is resolved, but because the mind is no longer in a constant state of threat. You think more calmly, you decide with more clarity, you act with less impulse, and that changes the quality of your choices. A tense mind spends energy trying to survive. A more relaxed mind begins to plan. And planning is a quiet gesture of prosperity. There is a kind of discipline that is born from pressure, and there is another that is born from alignment. When the mind relaxes, action stops being an inner conflict. You no longer need to push yourself all the time. You no longer need to negotiate with yourself at every step. You act because it makes sense. This discipline doesn't shout. It doesn't demand heroism. It doesn't ask for perfection. It feels more like continuity. One step after another, even when no one is watching, even when there is no immediate validation. And what is done this way tends to last. You don't wake up one day feeling like a different person. Change doesn't announce itself, but little by little, you notice that you respond differently. Where there was once hurry, there is now rhythm. Where there was once fear, there is now observation. Where there was once escape, there is now enough presence to continue. This isn't effort, it's identity reorganizing itself. You begin to act like someone who trusts more in their own inner timing. And identity, when it changes everything around it without asking permission. There is no exact moment when you realize it worked. Life doesn't send notifications, but small responses begin to appear. Conversations flow more easily. Decisions unlock. Situations that once felt confusing become clearer. Not because the world changed, but because you are no longer at war with it. A less reactive mind creates less resistance along the path, and life responds well to those who are not fighting it. Hurry begins to lose its meaning, not because you gave up, but because you realized that hurry comes from the fear of not having enough time. When the mind relaxes, time feels more spacious. You act at the right moment, not the anxious one. And what is born from this rhythm tends to be more stable, more sustainable, more coherent with who you are now. Flow doesn't accelerate, it sustains. Up to this point, the transformation was not announced, it was absorbed. Nothing was forced, nothing was promised. Something simply organized itself within. At some point, you realize that money no longer sits at the center of your mind. It remains important, it remains necessary, but it stops being a constant source of inner pressure. Before, thinking about money activated fear, comparison, urgency. Now, the thought arrives more clearly. You consider possibilities without feeling cornered. You evaluate paths without desperation. You decide more strategically because you are no longer reacting to immediate fear. This shift doesn't happen at the bank, it happens inside. And decisions made without tension tend to build more solid results. You no longer need dramatic bursts of motivation. You no longer depend on promises made in moments of excitement. You simply continue. Even on ordinary days, even without recognition, even without complete certainty. This continuity doesn't come from obligation. It comes from inner coherence. You move forward because it makes sense to keep moving. And that changes everything. Because what builds something lasting is not occasional intensity, it is repeated presence. Continuing is a quiet form of power. Life doesn't become perfect, it becomes less stuck. You begin to notice that some things resolve themselves with less effort, not because you became passive, but because you stopped creating inner resistance. Conversations become more direct, choices become more clear, adjustments become simpler. You no longer need to force situations to prove your value. You participate in the flow instead of trying to dominate it. And curiously, this is when opportunities begin to appear more naturally. There is no moment of celebration. No one outside can tell exactly when it happens, but something in you is no longer the same. Calmer, more stable, more whole. You didn't lose ambition, you lost rigidity. You didn't abandon dreams, you simply stopped chasing them from a place of fear. This rebirth doesn't ask for a stage, it shows up in daily life, in small choices, in how you respond, in how you support your own steps. And this is inner maturity. Maybe now you can see that relaxing the mind was not the end of the path. It was the right place to begin. Nothing here needed to be forced. Nothing needed to be promised. There was simply space for something to reorganize. And when the mind stops resisting, life finds a way in. If it feels right, stay with this for a while, not as a task, but as presence, and let the rest respond in its own time.